G'day, and welcome to another episode of Perth Property Insider. I'm your host, Jared Mann, and today I'm going through rent vesting versus home ownership. All the different factors, pros and cons, how to make both work for you. And it's going to be a great episode. So let's go inside.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management specialists servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here is your host, Jared Mann.
So let's get stuck into the considerations that are important when deciding whether to go out and buy your own home to live or whether you rent somewhere and invest on the side. Now, I had to go and make this decision when I was starting out. Just got my full-time job as an engineer, finally was earning, an okay income, had been thinking about buying my first property and had to weigh up, do I do that traditional route of home ownership and live in there for a while, or do I go and rent with a mate and start investing on the side? Now, I went the way of rent vesting, but it is a very personal decision, and I want to run through all the different factors to consider, starting with your budget. So when you sit down with a finance broker, you'll find that you can typically borrow more for an investment property than you can for your home. And I'm just talking top-level borrowing capacity here. So because you have that rental income from your tenant, that counts towards increasing your borrowing capacity, and you don't get that on your home, and you can't count any other, flatmates or boarders or anything. So usually you can borrow more for the investment property. Now that's providing that you have enough deposit to put down. So the amount that you can borrow in itself by buying that investment over buying the home, it can help you get into a better quality property. If you can borrow more for the investment, you can get into a better quality property, and that's likely to have better growth over the longer term. Now, if your deposit is limited, it's worth then looking deeper into the first home buyer incentives. And I'm going to cover off on them in a later section. So that can often help you buy at a higher price because you don't have to come up with stamp duty. You can borrow at a higher loan to value ratio. So then if your deposit's limited, you need to go deeper into looking at what that's going to do for your budget when you take into account all these incentives. All things considered, it's really important to be trying to get into the best quality of property that you can afford, because over the next 5 or 10 years after, the difference in growth, even at 1 or 2%, can be a big outcome when you compound that over 10 years. So personally, I think if you can't buy something at 400K or above now, and I'm talking to you, then it's best to keep saving or speak to your parents about being a guarantor to help out with, which basically means that they sit and put security over the loan as well, so that if you ever defaulted, the bank has a claim against them. It's a lot to ask of your parents, so don't take it for granted, but it could be an option for helping you, get that higher borrowing capacity earlier. And there's nothing wrong with having to save for a few years. I saved virtually from the time I was 16 to 22, 23, 24, saved really hard to get into my first few properties. And when I did buy my first investment property, I went 50-50 with my parents, and they contributed equity and I contributed some towards costs and renovations and things. So partnering up is another way of helping increase your budget, whether that be for investment or for your home. But think about whether you've got an alignment of purpose and goals and how long that is going to be for, because it is costly getting in and out of properties. So that's having parents potentially help out, and the guarantor is going to help, and likely mean that if you can't borrow at least and afford at least 400K, the reason I say that is not to be snobby or judgmental on price. The reason I'm saying that is that if you're below 400, you're going to have to go really far out of the city, and or you're going to have to look at higher density apartments or units, and the kind of growth that you're going to get on either of those options is going to be very limited. Could actually hamper you if it goes backwards, and things can be a lot more volatile in those types of markets too. So demand can drop off, prices can slide. We've seen it all too well over the last 10 years. So I would really be shooting for at least 400, preferably 450 if you can get up there. It can be very difficult when you're a single and you're starting out. So really look at trying to get that budget up to get into as best quality that you can, whether it be for home or investment. Now, it can be cheaper to rent in the shorter term. So that's a big factor to consider. Now, with rising interest rates, that's tipping even more towards renting in over the shorter term. But over the longer term, I'm going to run through that in a minute, but it starts to become more economical to own your own home. But in the short term, when even with rents going up, by the time you add on council rates, maintenance, and your principal loan payments, which usually by default you have to make when you're buying a home, you can find that the costs outweigh the rent that you'd otherwise have to pay, and it can be by quite a lot. So it can be shorter in the shorter term, it can be cheaper to rent and own that investment property on the side that doesn't take as much to anywhere near as much to upkeep because you've got a tenant helping pay for it. And it's worth noting that there is the option of paying interest only, usually for a 5-year period, on either your home loan or your investment property. But it is also possible on your home loan. That can take out the principal component and just help with that, shorter term affordability over the first 5 years. And you can always look to refinance if you have to, and you've still got, good financials to do that. So the other thing to note is that the higher up you go in price, the lower the rental yield and the cheaper it's going to be to rent versus buy, which is a bit of a no-brainer. So if you end up buying something at 700K, it's not going to rent out. You're going to have a much bigger gap, on what you need to pay, and that needs to be factored into. And all of this means that while renting, you should be able to put the cash flow towards savings and investing and buying that future house. You should, from a cash flow viewpoint, have a bit more when you're renting out. So the next factor is when we then go over the longer term, owning your own home becomes comparably cheaper. So why is that? Now, as you'd see already, and it's easier to see it these days, but everything continues to rise with inflation, and that includes rents and property prices. And in 5 to 10 years, you'll usually find that because you've locked in your purchase price, inflation's been working away, and the borrowing amount will then become cheaper compared to rents in the market. And your monthly cash flow is going to be a lot easier to own versus rent in that case. And once you've got a bit of equity in your property, you're usually able to go back and renegotiate your interest rates on your home loan. And that's because the bank sees you as less risk. So the lower your loan to value ratio, you're able to generally go and get a lower interest rate. So owning your own home becomes cheaper comparatively to renting over the long term because of inflation, increasing everything else, and hopefully leaving your repayments relatively the same. Hopefully your wages increasing, rents in the outside world are increasing for everyone else, and owning that home becomes comparatively more affordable. So don't just look at the upfront that it's cheaper often to rent than own. It does swing back the other way, and you've got to start somewhere. So let's go into these first home buyer benefits, because there's a number of benefits that can really help you get into the market sooner, which are not available if you're buying an investment property. So the first one is that you have no transfer duty to pay on your first home up to the value of $430,000. The other word for transfer duty is stamp duty. And there's lesser duty payable thereafter. So the scale is not as much for a general property either. So don't be necessarily afraid of paying over $430,000. You're still paying way less than you would have done if you weren't a first home buyer. So the savings of transfer duty is $14,440 on a $430,000 purchase. And that applies whether it's established or new. So big savings to be made that can really help you get in sooner. Now, that one of the other benefits is if you build new or buy brand new, you can get the first time owners grant of $10,000. That can really help you contribute towards your savings that you have as well. Of course, there's trade-offs in buying new, and you can listen to some of our other episodes where you can have a lot of land supply in those newer areas. Infill's certainly a better option than going and buying in a new land estate that's going to have land coming on forever, because in those areas it's going to keep prices subdued, and any benefit that you get from your first homeowners grant of 10,000 will quickly be drop in the bucket and outweighed by the better growth that you would have got in an infill area had you not opted for new and gone with established instead. So just be wary of chasing the shiny objects of new and thinking that you get your 10,000 and that everything's rosy. Look at where the location is and where you're actually buying that house. So the next thing here is the first home buyer's deposit scheme. And this can enable you to borrow up to 95% without paying lender's mortgage insurance. So another massive saving. When you borrow over 80%, you have to pay lender's mortgage insurance. That can be, as much as 10 to 15 grand at 90 and 95%. Really adds up. So the first home buyer's deposit scheme, really another big saving which can be made, and it doesn't matter whether the property is new or established. They only have certain places, a number of these, that the banks, the government's basically guaranteeing to the bank that you're not going to default in the place of the normal lender's mortgage insurance that would guarantee it. That's why you don't have to pay that lender's mortgage insurance to borrow up to that 95% level. Now, just beware that certain banks, like Keystart, usually have a higher interest rate attached to borrowing at this sort of level, at this higher level, because there is extra risk and they need to price it in. So it'll likely make sense to refinance to a lower interest rate loan once you get enough equity or enough savings in to qualify with a mainstream lender. And it can give you, once you get it down to 80%, you've had a bit of growth, you put a bit of savings in there, you can really help your cash flow by refinancing elsewhere. And Keystart's great because it gives people their start, and without it, many people wouldn't be getting into a home. But again, keep your head up and looking at your interest rate when you can. Look to refinance if possible. So just because you buy an investment property over a home, you don't obviously get these incentives. But if you did go the way of buying an investment property, you could still come and qualify for these things later if you decided to then buy your home later. So you may still and should still be able to qualify for these things. But don't think that just because you opt for the investment that you're going to miss out entirely. Now, what a lot of people do is mix up home ownership and then rent vesting. So they use the first home buyer benefits to buy that higher price property that they couldn't otherwise get into. They get in the market sooner, which is definitely good when hopefully the next 2 to 3 years, I expect there to be further price rises. And they get some housemates on a casual basis, informal sort of basis, to help out with their mortgage. And they stay there you need to stay in for a minimum of 6 months and check the requirements. This is as I understand them to be, before moving out to qualify for that first time owners grant. And you have to, and zeros, no stamp duty. And you have to move in at least some point during the first 12 months. Otherwise, you can find that you'll have to pay the stamp duty if you don't stick to all the requirements. So don't take what I'm saying here as the 100% accuracy. Check everything. And depending on the time you listen to it, these things can change. So they then move out and at some point look at making it a rental property. So it's helped them get in. At usually that point, you might be able to refinance to go interest only at that point with a main tier bank, lower interest rate, and rent it out. You've had all the incentives and other things to get in, and you've mixed it up. So the downside is that even though you might have housemates helping you on an informal basis, the bank doesn't count that income or that house board that you get towards your borrowing capacity. So unlike when you're buying an investment property, they count a tenant's income that you're getting, tenant's rent that you're getting towards your income, but not when you've got housemates on the informal basis. So next thing is to consider your needs that you're going to have at your various life stages, because until having gone through these, I never even knew or thought about for a second that my needs were going to change. And you have specific needs depending on how old you are and where you're at with with your overall family formation. So when you're just starting out, flexibility, you'd have to think, is the main need. So if you're young and you don't want to be tied down, you want ultimate flexibility for your home. You want to do travel, you want to do other stuff, you want to change the where you live maybe every year or two. You want to, sample all the different lifestyles across Perth. Well, when I was growing up, I lived in lots of different places and I'm great time of my life. So, it's great to try out all these different areas. And when you're doing that, often when you're living in higher density, it doesn't usually make a good investment. So, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, we just don't have the uniqueness. You got oversupply. You're probably not going to see the growth in it. So, it's going to make more sense to rent. Now, when I was in my early 20s, I lived in an apartment in Subiaco. I then lived in a unit in Northbridge. And it was great because I was close to work in the CBD. I got to, easily enjoy the nightlife, plenty of takeaway food options because I couldn't cook very well at that stage. I could walk to almost everything, which is great when you've been having a few drinks on a Friday and Saturday. And it made for a great lifestyle for that stage of my life, but would not make for a great investment. So better that I rented instead of bought there. That is for sure. Now, what's the next stage that you might often find yourself going through? Well, finding a partner is fabulous if they're the right one. And you, as a byproduct of that as well, if you're both working, you can have two incomes and all of a sudden open up a whole new range of, borrowing capacity and what you can both afford together. That's an exciting period, especially if you don't have kids yet, adding cost to things. So getting a partner and then having those two incomes really boosts your borrowing capacity and your options. And most couples want to buy a home together that they can, decorate and make their own. So it's worth considering renting together for a few years. And I did this with my partners as I was seeing if it's all going to work. It's a great way to have a trial run and see if it is right before you go making that big commitment of jointly owning a home. So once you've tried things out, it's not only just trying out how you live together, it's trying out if you like the area and if it's going to suit your needs. And you really need to think about, how serious is this relationship and are you going to look at starting a family soon? Because that's going to change the type of property that you're going to want to live in. There's no point, buying a really small unit and then deciding that you're going to have a baby and all of a sudden you're going to be changing your needs very rapidly. Now, worth remembering that it's a lot easier if the worst happens and you separate to break a lease than it is to sell a house. So unfortunately, separations happen and nothing, it really hurts when you've got a house together and it's just an extra layer of complications. So the next stage of things is having a family. So you found that partner, you might have rented or owned a property together, and then you start thinking about you having your first child or you've had your first child. You start thinking about a whole range of things that are important that you've never thought of before. And I certainly hadn't thought of these. So you really want stability. You want to own your own home because it's going to give you security that you won't have to move if your lease is not renewed. And you can get settled and you can make modifications. So a house really does become a home suitable for your family when you can modify it in the exact ways you want and, dress up your girl's bedroom and put up different things, change it around and, upgrade kitchens and bathrooms or whatever and, really customize it to your needs. Can't do that in a rental property. So I just found that renting wasn't going to gel with having a family for me, even though many people do it and it's a choice that many people also make. But for me, the pull towards home ownership certainly got a lot harder when I was having a family, pulling me towards it. Now, the other last one, which I'd never considered, was school catchments. Now, although you can still access great school catchments via renting. Owning ensures you can have a stable place in a school catchment. And if you want to be, especially in a popular school catchment, it can be very tough to find a rental in those areas, especially now. So owning in there guarantees your place and that you're not going to have to move. So lots of reasons then start becoming apparent when you're having a family, more towards the home ownership side instead of rent vesting. The next thing to notice and think about is the cost of changing homes. So one benefit of home ownership over rent vesting is that you have no capital gains tax to pay when selling your family home. And it's a big saving. And we don't get that when selling an investment. So you still have your entry and exit costs. So your stamp duty is the biggest one when you're entering, and your sales agent is the biggest one when exiting. And it's going to be around 5% when you're purchasing, 2 to 3% when you're exiting. So 7 to 8%, it does add up to change over. So that's why it's really good to get clear on what your needs are and if it's how long it's going to suit you before you go jumping in. But the one benefit there, you're not paying capital gains tax when you sell your home. So if you think it's going to be a short-term living situation, 2 to 3 years or less, then you may be better off renting. Yeah, sure, you don't get to make all those customizations and all the rest of it, but if you can still get into the school catchment that you want, still take a longer lease for 2 years or 3 years to give you that stability, and you only see yourself staying there that long, it's a lot of changeover costs to pay if you're not going to be there at least 5 or 10 years, in my opinion. You want to be trying to stay there that long. So, final consideration here is that you can use your property investment to buy your home. So, nothing is forever. You start out rent vesting, you build up your equity, you invest in property to try to improve your overall life. And many people, including myself, have used their property investments at different points to make that next upgrade of their home possible. I certainly wouldn't have been able to do it without having first created some wealth with my investing and then fed that back around to my home. And this may mean selling at different points to realize equity from that investment property that can't all be refinanced out, to then have lesser debt on the family home, but ideally you would keep your investment property working for you. So we've kept our first family home as an investment, and if we upgrade again, I'll be trying to look at keeping our current home in Wembley as well, and not paying those changeover the sale costs, and if I was going to add another property to our investment portfolio, I'd have to pay stamp duty and entry costs too. So why not try to keep the family home if possible, instead of paying down the loan? What I do along the way is just park money in offset, so then if it does become the investment later, you just pull all that money out, put it in out of your offset, put it into the new family home, so you've got less debt on the new place, and then that way you've got a ideally set up property for investment. So it doesn't have to be one way or the other. Today we've spoken about the pros and cons of each, and that you can actually mix things up using your first homeowner grant and incentives first, and then renting out after 6 months or so. We've also looked at making sure that you're committed, and because of those changeover costs really eat into things, and that it's going to be a longer term, something where you're going to live longer term. And we've also looked at, finally, how do you use your investments to change over and fund the dream home. So that's why a lot of people, if you can't get your dream home initially, a lot of people do just rent, work their way up, build up their wealth, and then roll it into the family home when they can get that dream. So I think if you're asking yourself this question, there's no right or wrong to either rent vesting or buying a home. And ultimately, the most important thing is that you've done one or the other, because you're going to be likely better off than just sitting outside, sitting on the sideline, especially when you add up the compounding on property over 5 or 10 years. Whether you've rent vested or bought a home, you've still done something. So thanks for tuning in. Just a reminder that the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature, as we don't know your specific situation. You should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.